And he's going to present his paper titled The Durban Movement on the shop floor. Before Prof takes over the stage, I want to give you his brief biography so that you understand who's Professor Lichtenstein that we have today. Professor Alex is a professor of history and American studies at Indiana University. He is the former chief editor of the American Historical Review, which he served from 2017 to 2021. He also taught at Rice University and the Florida International University. He has been a guest lecturer at the University of Cape Town and the University of Sao Paulo. Prof has written extensively about race relations in the US labor movement, interracial agrarian radicalism, early civil rights struggles, and impact of anti-communism on the labor and civil rights movements in both the US and South Africa. He's an author of Margaret Bookwhite and the Dawn of Apartheid. He wrote essays on South African history and politics, and he published with JSAS, JA, and SAGI. Currently, Professor Alex is focusing on the history of Black trade unions under apartheid. To avoid the disruption and the flow of our seminar, I'll also take this opportunity to invite our discussant of the day, Dr. David Hemson. I'll tell you a bit about Professor David Hemson before Prof. Alex takes over the stage. Um, David established the Student Wages Commission in South Africa in 1971, and he participated in Durban strikes in 1973. He also organized African and Indian workers and helped them find the unauthorized non-racial textile, furniture, dock, and metal unions before being house arrest in 1974. His thesis focused on the class consciousness of Durban migrant dock workers. He is an evaluator of development and he is writing on labor history and supporting workers' movements internationally. I will take this moment to give the platform to our presenter, Professor Alex.
Thank
Over
you,
to you,
Joy.
Prof.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for attending the seminar. Thank you to the journal and to the UFS History Department. It's really great to be back in South Africa again, even if only virtually. I was there 3 years ago at the Southern African Historical Society meeting in Makhanda, and I miss South Africa terribly. Especially kind of the intellectual interchange, which I find so rich every time I come to the country. So I'm eager to get back there in person. But but for today, this will just have to do, I guess. And I've been working on this project for a long time, which I hope shows in the paper. And so, Joy, I have about a half hour. Yeah, is that right? About 30 minutes?
Yes.
Yes, good. So a couple other remarks. One of the things I might have left out of my biography was my first trip to South Africa came 22 years ago, in the year 2000, when I was a Fulbright lecturer at the University of the Western Cape, during which time, of course, Professor Martin Legassic was a key figure at UWC. And Martin and I co-taught a graduate seminar on comparative US and South African history. And as I tell most people, I wasn't really co-teaching, I was really a student in that class. And so my introduction to South African history in a serious way really came at the feet of the great Martin Legassic. And I think my perspective to this day I assume David will agree, is really deeply imprinted with Martin's particular anti-Stalinist Marxism and emphasis on the life worlds and the possibilities of the working class and its ability to make a revolution from below. So that's very much where I'm coming from intellectually, and really deeply, deeply influenced by Martin, although I can't say I agreed with him on everything. I don't think any living person could say they agreed with Martin on everything, not even David. But I think that's a good preface to this paper. It'll give you a sense of where I'm coming from politically. The other thing, of course, Joy introduced David very nicely. But what's so fascinating about this, and one of the reasons I wanted David to comment on this paper, and he and I have been exchanging ideas for many years now, and he, in fact, is one of the people I interviewed for this project, is that David is not only a scholar of the Durban Moment, but also was a participant, a key participant in many ways. So that should make this especially interesting. Okay, so as you probably gathered if you read my little introductory remarks to the paper itself, the Durban Moment is what we might call a conjuncture. And in fact, in conversation with the late Tony Morfitt, who I believe coined the term the Durban Moment, he really emphasized to me that he imagined it, or came to the term by imagining it in terms of actually not history, but mechanical engineering. And he described to me what he meant by the moment, which really is a term, he said, derived from engineering, when you have a system that has many, many different moving parts that at a certain point lock into place so that all of the gears become enmeshed and the machine can turn. And that is very much the way that Tony imagined the Durban Moment. And that Tony is one of the few people I spoke with who never would let me tape him, unfortunately. But that conversation with him was really, really instrumental in helping me think about how to write a book about the Durban Moment. And that's the structure I've chosen, which is to say that each chapter will look at a particular mechanism or organization or tendency or group of people to understand how it came to lock into or fit with the others that made this conjuncture in 1973, the strikes and the birth really of a new organic grassroots trade union movement amongst African workers that made it possible. So as I put in that introductory section, what are the parts of this moment? All right, what were they in 1973 in Durban and really its surrounds, the hinterlands of Natal and KZN at the time? First, and the topic of this particular paper, which I'll go into detail in a few minutes, the seething shop floor discontent and pent-up demand for better conditions amongst the ordinary African working class in industry primarily, right? So here, one of the things I do in this paper and book is I get away from the focus on the mines. As important as they were, one of the things we need to pay much more attention to, I think, in South African working class history, it's what's going on in the factories in the 60s and the 70s, as those became a much more important part of the economy than they had been 20, 30, 40 years before. And posed a particular set of challenges to both employers and the apartheid state. So one of the things I want to get at, and that I try to get at in this chapter, is what is actually going on in a place like Frame Textiles, right? And a whole set of other factories in the Durban area. Secondly, there'll be a chapter on the constellation of white student radicals at the University of Natal, Durban, like David, who were oriented through the Student Representative Council, through the Wages Commission in particular, who often were acolytes of the radical philosopher Richard Turner, who were drawing on a whole set of new global intellectual currents of humanist Marxism. Turner, for example, was reading Erich Fromm, Marxism and Humanism, of existentialism, of Sartrean Marxism, and of New Left thought. right? So there's an intellectual history here that I've covered in some book articles about Rick Turner, that created a particularly interesting, I think, and maybe David will talk about this a bit more, eclectic new left moment in South Africa that drew on elements from outside, from Paris, from London, from Berkeley, um, but not really embedded in those places, partly because of the social and intellectual isolation which South African university students were subjected to. Again, I'm curious to hear from David about that. But that's a really important part of the picture here as well. Lots of people have written about this. David himself, Glenn Moss, Steve Friedman. I mean, you can go Johnny Copeland. I mean, there's a whole cohort of these people. In Durban, in my view, the key figures were David and his comrade Halton Cheadle, who I also have interviewed. And there are others, of course. Third, this comes as no surprise to any of you, I am sure, but the other sort of, excuse me, the other ferment in the Durban area in the early 70s, late 60s and early 70s was Steve Biko and Black consciousness. Very, very important. With Rick Turner, again, as kind of a transmission belt to some of those ideas over to the white left. That said, and although I'll pay attention to this in my book, I have to say, and I'm happy to be corrected on this, that my sense is that those young people involved in BC at the time were not particularly adept at reaching out to the working class on the factory floor. Yes, they set up a Black Workers Council or committee, I forget what it's called. Yes, in their journal, they address this, but fundamentally, my sense anyway, is that there's not really that good a connection with the African working class, although I'm happy to be corrected about that. Fourth, and also very important, and here's where I'm going to ask for people's input afterwards, is there's the question of Zulu nationalism, the gravitation toward Buthelezi and the kind of pseudo-sovereignty of KwaZulu that's emerging in the early 1970s, and that's given oxygen by labor migrancy. That is, many of these workers are going back and forth between Durban and Durban area factories. And KwaZulu, as David knows, and probably we'll talk about, the key figure in linking the sort of Zulu nationalism to worker insurgency was a man named Barney Dladla, really interesting guy. Actually, David, I just went back through some of my notes and I discovered an article about Dladla that reminded me that he was very much imbued with PAC ideas, right, with PAC ideas. And a Sobukwe man more than a Mandela man, which I had forgotten, and that's very interesting. But he and Buthelezi essentially tangle in 74, 75, and he's shoved aside. And the subsequent history, of course, is kind of a split workers movement where Inkatha tries to set up their own union formation. But that is later history. In 73, there's a very important sort of engine of worker insurgency that is, I believe, linked to Zulu identity. But this is the chapter I really still have to write. Fifth, the employers. I've written an article about this or two. The role of the employers here is very, very important. Particularly, the one thing to really keep in mind, I think, about looking at this moment is that most of the struck employers are English language employers, not Afrikaners, okay? They're the English language employers who imagine themselves as the liberals, of course, right? And they are hoisted on their own petard, often by Fillion who's the Minister of Labor, and the Nats, who keep saying, well, you're always complaining about us and apartheid, but the real problem here, Martin, is you need to pay your workers more. And then, your workers go on strike and you call the security police. We're not coming this time. Actually, Alex Mouton has a very funny anecdote where his father was a police commander in Natal, and he gets a call in the middle of the night from a factory owner who says, my workers are on strike, can you bring the police forces over here? And he hangs up on him and he won't take the call. So, but the point here is that the employers are facing first a productivity crisis, second, a lack of or unwillingness to communicate, as they would put it, with their workforce. and are kind of caught with their pants down and scramble to come up with solutions, but in my view, are fundamentally unwilling and unable to abandon apartheid managerial relations, namely authoritarian workplace relations, without consultation. Um, and the other element here, probably not worthy of a chapter, but just lingering in the background, of course, is the apartheid state itself and its simultaneous desire to keep the lid on, but also to create the appearance of reform in order to fend off international criticism, for example, and to keep the economy afloat. All right. Um, so, um, so those are the elements that make this moment. Now, as I explained, the short book that I'm working on devotes a chapter to each of these elements, maybe not to the state itself, but to BC, to the students, to the workers, to the employers, and so forth. The chapter I asked you all to read is really, I think, the crucial one, and it's about the shop floor discontent, and more importantly, the shop floor activism that is spurred on by this moment. Now, I know it's a bit unusual and didn't have formal footnotes because that's not the kind of book I am writing. But just to give you a sense of what some of the key sources are for this particular chapter, the crucial source really is the oral history I did with Jabu Kobo himself. Okay. Um, then the Durban strikes, which is still the only book written about the Durban strikes. It was written really in 1973, 74 by, it's hard to say exactly who by, but by the people surrounding Rick Turner, by Rick, by Fosia Fisher, uh, his partner at the time, maybe by David, by Jerry Maria, by Harold Nkasana, and a whole bunch of other people in that orbit at the time. But not all, and it's really a terrific book. I mean, I really think it would be nice to get a new edition of it with some notes and some annotations because it's absolutely fantastic, based on very immediate interviews with striking workers. And one of the things that helped me a lot was going to look at the transcribed interviews that sit the Alan Payton Center. As I think I say in the paper, they're translated from Zulu into English, and there are three different versions depending on who translated them. I don't know who did the translations. Almost certainly Harold Akasana did some of them, but there's no guarantee who is translating what. But those are fascinating documents. A lot of the material about sort of day-to-day resistance or weapons of the week, whatever you'd like to call it today, that was explicitly discussed in the text itself. Pretty remarkable, I think, in 73 and 74 to recognize forms of working class resistance to shop floor discipline without the formal auspices of a union. I thought that was really, really amazing, drawing on some pretty creative sociology of the time. I'd be curious again what David has to say about that. That was a key source. The Fossatu papers were a key source. Some of the shop floor newspapers that people like David were putting out, Isi Benze and others were key sources. And what else? Oh, and then thinking back to the period prior to 73, the Department of Labor records are extraordinary in terms of describing day-to-day disputes on the shop floor. But as I allude to in the paper, much to my frustration, all of the Department of Labor records from 1965 on have vanished. All right. These are incredible sources. What I did with the stuff in the early 60s, as many of you may know, under the so-called Settlement of Disputes Native Labor Act of 1953, there's this elaborate ersatz labor relations bureaucracy set up for African workers, which consists of so-called native labor officers. And when there's a dispute, when workers down tools, for example, because they're forced to work overtime, or they're promised a bonus and a wage and they don't get it, or they're beaten by the foreman. Sometimes the native labor officer is called in and here's both sides of the story, and even sometimes ruled in favor of the workers. But for my purposes as a researcher, the actual details of the dispute are recorded quite elaborately, and those are amazing. And I would just, give my maybe my left arm, since I'm right-handed, I'd give my left arm to see the Department of Labor Native Labor Officer reports from 1969, 70, 71. And I cannot find those. If anyone has a friend in the Department of Labor, I'm sitting there in Pretoria at the National Archives, and I just know in my heart that 50 meters away from me, in a basement under the Department of Labor, these records are sitting there moldering away. I just know it. And no one I know has been able to figure out how to find these papers. So I would love some hints about that. Okay, so let me wrap up in about 10 minutes by describing to you. Yeah. Okay. By describing to you what I think are the takeaways from the particular paper that I asked you to read, from this chapter about the nature of the shop floor under apartheid and its coming apart at the seams in the early 1970s. So first, I think these are all pretty clear. Even during the most so-called quiescent period of working class life under apartheid, i.e. from about 1961 to 1972, or maybe 1970, depending on when you want to date it, even then there was plenty of shop floor direct action and protest going on a day-to-day basis under the very, very restrictive parameters of the Native Labor Act, and of course, without formal union organization or recognition, and without the right to strike. There still was plenty of working class self-activity, as CLR James liked to call it, going on, all right? And that in turn formed a kind of a base or a foundation for what happens in 1973, I believe, right? That foundation rests on several factors. One, a key group of skilled workers in the frame plant, the weavers, right? I'd forgotten or not realized this, but when I just interviewed 2 or 3 weeks ago, June Rose Nala's daughter, Jabu Nala Hartley. June Rose has been sick and in hospital and doesn't really like to be interviewed, but her daughter is a wonderful person who lives in Oxford, England, has been interviewing her and told me some of her stories, but she reminded me that June had worked as a weaver as well, just the way that Jabu Nkobo did, and that was a key place in frame in terms of skilled workers who had a certain position that allowed them to organize. Secondly, and I think this is really important, one of the perverse, and I don't know anyone else has really said this, one of the perverse kind of unintended effects of apartheid law, influx law in particular, was this necessity, if you wanted to gain Section 10 residential rights, you had to work for the same employer for a long term, 10 years, I believe, actually, although I may have the exact figure right. And so what that actually meant was that what normally would have been a workforce with very, very high turnover and churn that makes it very difficult to organize a union. I'm going to give you an example. At IU right now, the graduate students are trying to organize a union, and the university recognizes, well, we could just wait a couple of years, they'll just graduate. So, if we can just fend it off, there'll be new graduate students 4 years from now, and they won't be so organized. But in an apartheid factory, actually people stayed put and worked year after year. And that created the ability to form tight internal networks, I believe. And I think there's some good evidence for that. So that's in place as well. Thirdly, although, and again, this is my most controversial point, if you want, maybe not in this crowd, is that the nationalist historiography, i.e. the ANC nationalist historiography, the SACP nationalist historiography, insists that the Durban strikes and the Durban moment was generated by this cohort of Saktu and underground organizers who had just been lying in wait underground like a group of cicadas that would emerge 17, or in this case 13 years later, and stimulate the working class. And that's just utter bullshit, in my humble opinion. Here I know David agrees with me because he and Martin went head to head with that line. SOC2, at least in terms of seeding the workplace with activists, really was nowhere to be found, in my view. Okay. However, the memory of SOC2 was there. And that's very important. And the memory of SOC2 was there in two ways. One, a history and memory of struggle. And here again, I think my interview with Jabo Nkobo was absolutely key to recognize and to discover that his father had belonged to so-called Gwala's union, Harry Gwala's SOC2 union, and Sarmkol in the rubber factory up to 1960, at which point in the state of emergency, he burned his union card and said to his wife and Jabo and his children, don't ever talk about this. So the memory of SOC2 is both there as a memory of struggle and also as a memory of the danger of political repression if you join a quote unquote political union. Okay. And I think that's really, really important. Another takeaway, this was very much an organic movement of workers themselves who had had enough. And the role of David and Halton and other students who came. And David, I remember so vividly the first time I interviewed you, and you've said this elsewhere before, when you and Halton go down to the docks and the workers say to you, where have you guys been? We've been waiting for you, right? So there's the sense that there's this organic moment that certainly is emanating from within the working class itself, but the students bring a certain set of skills and possibilities and serve as a spark plug or yeast or whatever you want to call it. But they are not creating much. Of course, the state really believed that these were outside agitators. And if you simply ban David and Halton and the rest of them, the problem will go away. Right? That's always how states react to working class insurgency. They try to persecute the so-called leaders. It's usually a misguided approach because it doesn't take account of the actual grievances and actions on the ground. Another takeaway, I think, though, it is important to recognize that the Durban moment was conditioned by a certain larger political economy, primarily a productivity crisis. That is, the employers recognize that South African capitalism is in a weak position. It's not keeping up globally because productivity is astoundingly low. Now, they tend to understand this through the racist lens. Oh, the problem is the African workers. But occasionally someone breaks through and says, well, maybe the problem is apartheid. Like if your workers are traveling 3 hours a day to and from work and they don't have enough to eat, maybe they're not going to be very productive. A few people point that out. Obviously, the left points this out. A few liberal white economists point this out. But the other thing that's going on, as I point out in my paper, is that there's not only a productivity crisis, but there's essentially a balance of payments crisis, right? And the rand has to be devalued. This is what stimulates unconscionable inflation. And of course, workers who are barely making ends meet and can barely pay for transport and food, let alone anything else, are hit by this inflationary pressure in 1972, 1973. I do think that's really important. And of course, although when I wrote this paper, it didn't speak to the political moment, it speaks to this political moment quite gravely, that inflation has really, really severe consequences for working classes living on the edge. Another crucial takeaway, I've written about this at length elsewhere, is that the so-called reform that employers in the state come up with is the expansion of these non-union workers and liaison committees. We can talk about that more, but the key point is this is designed to create some sort of transmission belt or communication formation inside the factories, but one that is tightly controlled by the employers. It doesn't work out that way. I firmly believe that the activists find a way to penetrate and use these committees, and they actually form the shell of what emerges as the Soweto unions a few years later. And I have plenty of evidence that the people who serve on these committees later emerge as shop stewards in the Textile Workers Union, in MAWU, and Chemical Workers Union, and others. So that's really important. And again, to me, this is a large part of a much larger debate about whether the struggle should use or not use the tools that the state inadvertently places in their hands. And in this case, I think it was pretty obvious that using those tools was a path to working class power, at least potentially. Another very interesting thing here, I don't go into great detail, but it's important. David may disagree. The strikes are not really suppressed. You've got mass strikes of 100,000 people, 350 people are arrested. I mean, the police are called out, but their response is actually, if you think about it in the context of the time and the laws at their disposal, pretty restrained. I know that's easy for me to say. People like David who were arrested and banned, people like June Rose and Obed Zuma who were detained, Harold Nkasana who was tortured, I mean, might not see it that way. But the strikes themselves, very few striking workers are actually arrested at the moment. I think that's important. And finally, one other really key point that maybe I don't emphasize, well, I think there's a lot of it in the paper, is the other driving factor here, the other structural factor, I think, and again, I'd be very curious what David has to say about this, is the growing proletarianization of the African working class in the factories. By that, I mean the increasing association of their futures and their life worlds with making ends meet in Durban as part of a settled peri-urban working class, rather than orienting themselves toward accumulating enough to return to the kraal, the homestead in the countryside. Again, that's hard to prove, but I do think it's important. And of course, as many of you know, the social geography of Durban is really, really important here, right? Even a migrant workers may be traveling 12 miles from KwaZulu to Pinetown to work or maybe to live in the Kranskloef hostel outside of the Pinetown factories, living in Claremont, working in Pinetown, but perhaps technically a migrant worker who is still a quote unquote resident of KwaZulu 12 miles away, right? It's not like migrating from the Eastern Cape to the Rand. Right? It's migrating a dozen miles, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly. So here I really have been hard, and some of my other things on Mamdani, who I think completely misunderstands the nature of migrancy in KwaZulu-Natal and Durban. Just going over the hill to the next town over, and you're a migrant worker. So finally, some questions that I would really appreciate some guidance on. For me, there are many, but two central unanswered questions. One, as I alluded to at the beginning, really the nature and dynamic of a Zulu identity, Zulu nationalism, Zulu fealty by migrant workers to the pseudo-sovereignty of KwaZulu. How important is that? How does one track it? What role does it have in the strikes? And two, to me, the other thing, and I thought about this, Joy, when you introduced David as someone who had organized African and Indian workers. The place and role of Indian workers, which is discussed sometimes in the Durban Strikes pamphlet, remains a little bit opaque to me. But certainly it is clear to me that when the strikes break out on January 9th, 1973, at the Coronation Brick Factory among Zulu migrant workers, there's a potential moment for the first few days that this could devolve into another 1949. Right? We have to remember that, the 1949 riot in Durban is well in the living memory of most of the people in these communities. And for Indians especially, are afraid. They're afraid that this is going to turn into a 1949. Mercifully, it does not. I haven't quite tracked the reasons why it does not. But Indian workers, I just don't have a good handle on whether they stand aside, whether they join. Some of them certainly are regarded by African workers as a kind of a layer of managerial or supervisory power, which makes them vulnerable. So if David has remarks on that, and I have to say, when I look back at my long list of interviewees, other than Omar Badsha, I've not really interviewed anyone. And Omar, of course, was really a person, entangled in with Rick Turner and with the IIE and with the people who were making this go. I've really not interviewed. The only Indian comrade I interviewed long ago is the late Billy Nair, who, of course, was a SACTU person and wasn't really, unless I'm mistaken, wasn't on the ground in the early 1970s. So that's a good half hour. I welcome David's comments. Let me get out a pen, and certainly any comments or contributions from the floor. Thank you very much, and I'm all ears.
If I could say, Rick, you put me in an invidious position. I'm not in the front rank of footballers, but now I've got to score about 12 goals in 10 minutes.
You called me Rick, though, David. You called me Rick, not Alex. So
I developed my football mainly in prison, because actually you had more time on your hands to perfect these small arts. Now, can I first of all commend you, Alex, in terms of what you've done? I think you've done a marvelous job, and I'll just develop some issues in terms of technique and bringing the past back to life and making it accessible and diagnosable, if you can use that term, and able to be thought about again. I think you've done a skillful and innovative recreation of the networks of leading workers and the evolution of their consciousness. And this is important because people start to think we are, in a sense, agents of our own being. In other words, whether we're struggling to have a life, you talk about life possibilities, futures, and all that, how we struggle with our conditions, how that changes our ideas and makes things, makes a new world of possibilities more accessible. And what you deal with quite sensitively, and I think it's very important because I've not seen it done elsewhere, is to show how Black workers were breaking free from the hangover of the past. And I think your remarks about the Gwala Union and so forth, I knew all of that in my bones. I heard it, but I never recorded it. I remember we were activists. We were running around trying to cause a revolution. We weren't wanting to write the history. We wanted to write the future of the revolution. So a lot of stuff has just, gone past, but you've skillfully brought that back to life. And if I could mention, in the paper itself, or the chapter, you mentioned Rosina Piri, you mentioned Gladila, and one other worker. Rosina I knew well. She used to train workers. And what a trainer, because she actually made sure they all joined the union when they learned how to become a weaver or a spinner. Marvelous. And the main point, a point about that, women workers were absolutely decisive, if I can make that point.
Absolutely.
If I could just reflect a little bit, and I won't reflect too much, otherwise my 10 minutes are gone. We concentrated on the existing organized factories. And you mentioned the role of the Indian workers. At that time, it was not a happy situation. We've mentioned SACTU in the past as a heroic trade union. What we found when we started organizing in the factories where there were Indian and African workers, and we took up one of the fragments of SACTU, that was the Textile Workers Industrial Union, was a key member of SACTU. And there, if I could use careful language, relations were not at all good, not at all good, between Indian and African workers. And we worked hard to break that, mainly because there was lots of union corruption and setting, and it was based on collusion with management. So we had, look, I was an innocent little white boy. I didn't know about all these tricks, but it became very evident when I would go to a factory where they had previously been one of the SACTU unions, and they would say, go away, tell us until you can tell us what happened to our money. No one's raised that in relation to, the heroic past. But I don't want to just tell stories of that kind. I want to also record, the incredibly positive role of African textile women workers, Junro's among the leader. Boy, you end up splitting your sides with laughter, the way she dealt with white management and some of the Indian colleagues.
Stories,
She was full of fun and a tough person to deal with, but she brought, she represented the aspirations. Could I just mention and conclude on this, African women workers? When we found the African male workers were reluctant to join a unauthorized union, you used the term, Alex, so I must give you credit for that, because they thought it was not legal. And also that had a bad history because it was basically a union activity was basically Indian dominated. So that's not good news. But then the women workers would say, we're going to join. And I would say to the women workers, are you joining? Yes, we're joining. And the men would say, well, we want to see the Constitution. And we want to argue about this. And we want to know the history and all the rest of it. And then I would say to the women workers, must the men join? Yes, they must. And then we got our 100%. So, I think the women workers are fresh. They didn't come with a whole history of repression and so forth. No. And they were fighting on so many fronts, so many social fronts. And I'll come back to the question of a social change, to bring that to bear. The second point I'd make in terms which comes alive, and by the way, I'm not going to be able to deal with all your points. I have noted them. The absolute autonomy of the spontaneous. When people move into action, we talk about Zulu identity, and maybe that has a certain negative connotation, especially to non-Zulu people. I felt Zulu at that time of the strike. Why? Because the workers were dancing. It's not a matter of standing there with a stick wanting to beat somebody, and including me possibly with a white skin. Not like that at all. They were dancing and saying, come and join us, you see, and so forth. It's an open culture. It was a culture of resistance. If you can, wouldn't say humble yourself, but if you could join in on that and come on side, which is what we want, the door was wide open, not just a bit open, wide open. And you just had to enter it and give your all to be able to build a resistance movement, which was genuinely non-racial. It would use the Zulu language, absolutely. Zulu culture, who could improve on the slogans of the workers? You mentioned Asina Mali. Okay, that's a bit of a sad song. Okay, Asina Mali, I won't sing it to you. I used to criticize it. But then we have the statement by the workers that man's spirit is dead, but we live on. And we are reborn. I mean, it's deeply inspiring. And I don't think that whites who've written about the Zulu culture, and maybe even Vilakazi, writing about Zulu culture, being a Zulu himself, captures quite this sense of dignity, of deep thought and deep spirituality. If I could use the term as a Marxist, I have to say a little bit careful about that, but it's there. It's extraordinary and it's generous. And in a sense, then a Zuluness is not a cutting off of other groups. It is actually an open incorporation of other people. By the way, many of the workers that you've identified could be identified as Pondo. If I could just briefly mention Wiseman and Bali, a particularly a good friend of mine, but not necessarily a friend of everybody. He's a tough man, and he was not averse. He was a rural guerrilla fighter, if I could use the term. He was part of, the mountain, of rural resistance, and right there in Frentex. And if you look at the pictures of the strikes, and I won't show them all here, I could spend an hour or two there, but Wiseman is right in the center of it, with his little hat and so forth. He looks so inconspicuous. I think he probably only went 2 years at school, but he's a master of strike resistance, and he will deal with the opposition in the way they'll really regret. He's quite used to being tortured and being beaten. He's a fighter of note. So you had all of that mix in there, and it was, I don't think I didn't understand it, and even still today, I'm still learning. But there it was formidable. So you have the absolute autonomy of the spontaneous, unexpected developments. It started in Coronation. We never had anything to do with Coronation. We white student activists, but we had quite a lot to do with the textile industry and the docks. But they didn't figure immediately there. Frame text exploded. It was a huge surprise. So everything is spontaneous. No one can put a copyright on a strike movement of this kind. We were focused on the organized factories, and they were the last to move. So fresh layers of workers were coming freshly involved. It was a rebirth of resistance, of explosive, expansive, rolling mass action, not automatically leading on to organization, overreaching itself, going on too far in a sense, and inspiring us. I used to be the advocate of a human wall strike movement. Halton would say, hold on, we've got to slow down and consolidate. And as he was right, but it created that momentum that we thought actually we would be rolling on year after year until we defeated apartheid. What is the point of just having a strike like this? And yet the political, all right, let me come to that point. We need to explore the meaning of a social revolution. I know that when I arrived in exile in London, people were saying, well, it's just a wage movement. Just a wage movement. Yes, of course, the wages were the main demand, but what is behind the wage? The wage is the core of the cheap labor system. It had to be low. If you did not keep that wage ultra low, there was no point to the whole apparatus of apartheid, of the cheap labor system. Just to explain that, that meant the police, the pass, the compounds, the tribal leaders, including Chief Buthelezi, he was key to this whole apparatus, which oppressed the workers. And then, of course, the employer who implemented at a factory regime, you know, the apartheid labor system, and we were breaking it. In other words, it's not a revolution is not 0 or 100. A revolution is biting away, breaking down an existing order until you're able to be strong enough to take power. Unfortunately, the labor movement, strike movement, has been, you know, like the Israelites in Egypt, you know, working as slaves. And then we've spent many, many years in the desert, you know, trying to build our resources and build an independent leadership to be able to take things forward. Who would have believed that come freedom, we now find we've got 12 million unemployed? But look, I want to return to the social revolution. In other words, the people that you've identified, Alex, were the energetic revolutionaries. Let's call them revolutionaries because they were that, sidelined and smothered by nationalism, because who's interested in people down there when you've got brilliant intellectuals like Thabo Mbeki and other people who've been given scholarships to go abroad and feted in Moscow and everywhere else. And now, when we come to look at what's happened today and to those people, we find that the frame group, the textile industry, has been smashed in South Africa at the hands of the ANC. In other words, all this marvelous struggle, we never thought it would lead to destruction of industry. We thought it would take forward society rather than break down. We would have to break whole sections of the cheap labor system, low wages and so forth. But the idea of it would be that out of this, we would get a society. Thank you for, you know, there's a generator. We would create a new society, dare I use the word socialism, but at least that we would have a state which would intervene for the workers and organize production, not disorganized production as we've seen. So I would like to explore, conclude on this point, that we want to look back to the past. The analogy has been made of strikes of, you know, of waves, the sea waves on the shore, and then we wanted to see how that is not ebbed. It has ebbed for a while, but that those waves will be returning, and we'll be seeing a new formation of the labor movement into the future. I'm sorry, I'm going into the future. I'm not into the past, but I've made a note of all your other points, and I think I'll just have to stop now because of as Zimbabwean workers say, time is the enemy. By the way, we have a general strike of Zimbabwean workers today. We're celebrating on that. Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation to comment, and I hope it's been intellectually useful as well as giving some sort of record. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you.
David. Joy, can I just make a few very quick remarks? So the photograph here is one that was passed on to me by June Rose Nala's daughter last week. That's June Rose with Alec Irwin behind her. I don't know the exact date on this, but clearly it's post 1979 because she's got a Soweto t-shirt on. So a couple quick, really great stories that I heard about June Rose, because I think you're absolutely right, David. I mean, she was unbelievable. First of all, she went into frame as a worker when she was like 16 or 17 years old. I hadn't realized that. Unbelievably young, and as a mother. Okay. And women's issues were really central to her. Two funny stories that her daughter told me, funny maybe not, but that indicative of her strengths. One, there was one mass meeting inside the factory. Of course, management knew who she was. Maybe you remember this moment, David. So she dressed up as an old woman, snuck in with all the other workers, then got in front, got up on the stand and started speaking, and all of the managers were like, wait, how did she get in? We're looking around. It was a very funny story. She was very clever, apparently. And two, the women, I think, David, thank you. I mean, that's so key. And you're reminding me here, one of the reasons is they don't have a lot of this previous baggage, right? So they come in fresh, as you say. They have a set of issues and struggles of their own. And many of them are living in this giant hostel, which still stands in Claremont, right on the edge of Pinetown, called the Kranzkloof Hostel. And this was when I said to June's daughter, I said, oh, well, did she go out to organize in Kranzkloof? And she immediately was, yes, of course. That is a crucial place where women workers were consolidated in a single place and faced a set of social struggles, including harassment, sexual harassment, rape, and threats from Tsotsis. And so who would come every night and try to rape the women in the hostel. And Jabu Nala Hartley told me this story, how June Rose said, we've had enough of this shit. So what you're going to do is we're all going to take some bricks and we're going to stand on the top floor. And when the Tsotsis come tonight, we're going to rain the bricks down on their heads and drive them away. And that's what they did. And that was that. That's the story. I don't know if true, not, David. I don't know if you heard this story. But again, the larger point is that she was willing to organize people around all sorts of issues, and particularly around women's issues and protecting women from violent assault. So I think that's very important. And then secondly, thank you, David, for the remarks about Zulu culture and spirituality. And yeah, Asina Male might have been one, but this was not about wages. This was about dignity on the job. This was about being treated decently, which, as you point out, was fundamentally, kick the props out of apartheid, because so much of that was dependent on, and the very, so one of the things I realized as I read through so many of these labor officer reports is day-to-day physical abuse, humiliation, and demeaning treatment was de rigueur, and that's how management worked in a workplace with white and perhaps Indian managers and African workers. Day-to-day humiliation, physical abuse, these shouted commands and orders, right? I think I actually, once I reread the paper, that was my favorite part, this sort of, of course there was low productivity. Of course, look at how you're trying to manage your workers. Ridiculous. And so part of this effort to build unions was not just to win a wage packet, but which is to defend dignity in the workplace and by extension in one's life as a human being, and rather than just as a unit in the factory who could be, thrown around like a donkey or a piece of machinery. So I think that's really, really essential, and thank you for calling attention to that. Okay, so I will now shut up. Joy, you tell me what happens next, or maybe you just take questions from the floor.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. Colleagues, I'll open the platform for any questions, any contributions. We are going to take a round of 3 questions. Then we give Alex some time to answer, a moment to answer. You can raise your hand. I can see Mariam is raising her hand. Anyone else with a question? Mariam, you can go on.
I think you're muted. Mariam, I can't hear you. Still muted. But keep your eyes on the road, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah. I said your focus is on the Durban moment, but I want to find out whether there's any link between that one and then the Soweto Revolt. Was there any way in which the latter one was influenced by the earlier one? Was there any inspiration from the earlier revolt? That's my question.
Good question.
Yeah.
We're waiting for 3 though, right, Joy, before I respond?
Yeah, but you can go on and answer to Mariam's question. It's fine.
I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, Mariam. I mean, certainly the way I posed it in my paper and in my introduction was to recognize these as kind of parallel developments and moments, right? And so my sense has been, at least in the historiography, that we really look to 1976 as the moment in which the lid came off, and from then on it was quite clear that apartheid could not stand, and that an internal opposition within the country would bring it down through international links, through making the country ungovernable, and that this was emanating from Soweto and particularly from the youth. Now, as you know, many of those youth then exfiltrated, and this helps swell the ranks of MK in the late 70s and early 80s. So at least the way I posit it is that this workers' movement that isn't just confined to Durban, I mean, in some ways that's its heart and center, but it very rapidly spreads to the East Rand and to the metal shops on the East Rand especially, and that throws up a whole similar set of dynamics, both with the student movement at WITS and people like Steve Friedman and Glenn Moss and many others. Phil Bonner, of course, being another, and deeply embedded in the factories across the East Rand, the metal factories especially. But I guess, although I'm happy to be corrected, and I'd be curious what David says, I see that as a very, very separate movement, a separate dynamic, and generated by different social forces and grievances. Now, of course, what happens in the late 70s and early 80s is a confluence of the youth movement as it emanates from Soweto, and the workers' movement as it emanates from Durban and then from the East Rand. But I see them as separate. And I guess the question to me becomes, what happens in that confluence? And ultimately, unfortunately, I guess I would say, is that in that confluence, workerism, as it was called derisively, that is the notion that there was a separate, independent, and necessary energy in the workplace that could help make a revolution, became subordinated to a larger political project, which of necessity had the ANC and the SACP in the driver's seat. So in terms of a politics, it was the subordination of the workers' movement to a vanguard party divided between Orthodox Marxism and the SACP and ANC nationalism that in some ways sapped the strength or redirected the movement away from workers' concerns. That's my larger political view. But there may have been more fruitful interactions between the youth movement and the working class movement than I have spotted so far. I'm willing to say that. Now, I mean, one tension that immediately appears, if you look at 76, and here I don't know the historiography well enough, it very rapidly spreads from a youth protest about school shutdowns to an attempt to create a general stay away. And whether older workers are willing to heed that stay away or not would have been, I think, the crucial political decision at the moment in winter 1976. I'll leave it at that. David, I'm curious your views of the sort of the relationship between Soweto and Durban, if you will.
Well, look, let me try and be brief. When I was at the anti-apartheid demonstration outside South Africa House in late June 1976, I was denounced because we didn't, the unions we had didn't immediately come out on general strike. But just consider this. We had struggled and we had sort of 0.1% organized the industrial working class, quite apart from the mines,
Right.
Farm workers, domestic workers, and all the rest of it. So the expectation among nationalists was that the unions should commit suicide. I'm putting it a bit sharply. In other words, if there's something else that happens, which is called political, you throw yourself into the struggle and you all end up in prison or you lose your jobs. But anyway, the worse the better, because then that's more revolutionary, you see. Now, look, I'm being a bit crude the way I'm talking, but I'm talking, this was literally said to me, but let's just think about it. 73 was shaking the foundations. Just think how structured society is. The workers are at the base of all economic activity. If the workers don't move and move into production, the ships are not unloaded, all society comes to a halt. Unfortunately, the fact was with students, heroic and absolutely marvelous. I mean, running against bullets is, incredible, but it's incredibly high cost and inevitably short-lived with an apartheid state, which is highly militarized. And so therefore there were disjunctures. I think to get the best understanding of it, we need to look at the history of Russia or Poland, where they alternated between student movements, which are ultra radical and then didn't have worker support. And then the workers came out and didn't have student support.
1905 is so crucial here.
Yes, so there is disjuncture, unless there's some unifying factor. And by the way, there was none. The ANC had no political underground. It just had recruiting networks for MK. And I could give you chapter and verse because I worked with MK in the 1970s. And so we had this problem of people just being exported, not an internal resistance built. It took till 1985, 86, with the formation of a mass movement against apartheid, to achieve that. That took a long time, to develop. But look, in short then, workers at the foundation, students in a sense at the political and in the schools and elsewhere. Unfortunately, I feel that the way the struggle developed when I was in Dar es Salaam a few years later, in 1979, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of students from Soweto, and they were all, well, not in good shape, if I could put it that way. I don't want to go into the whole history of MK, but they were criticizing the leadership, and there were suicides and this huge homesickness. So in other words, the development of an internal resistance, uniting students and workers, took some time to achieve. And I can't say that one thing automatically led on to the next. But once you shake the foundation, the tops are also going to feel the pressure. And I think that's allowed the students, or created a situation where students could make a greater movement. And I want to salute those students who fought desperately against apartheid because they gave their lives.
So just to conclude on that, I mean, that is really a fruitful question, Mariam. So, I mean, in a way, 76 put South African resistance to apartheid on the international map in a new way. I would say internationally, globally, there was a lot more attention to the Soweto Revolt than there was to the Durban strikes. That said, one of the things that happens in the Durban strikes and then subsequently is quite clear that the unions that begin to grow out of that moment are very strategic. They realize that they need to organize multinationals, because as soon as that happens, then people in London and New York start paying attention. And that's very much what happens. So I think David and I talked about this, but what happens in 73 is a really fascinating expose of the status of South African workers in British multinationals. done by a journalist for The Guardian named, what was that dude's name? Adam Raphael. So it doesn't quite put, and there's actually a parliamentary hearing about South African workers inside British multinationals, kind of under the radar, but it's thousands of pages long. I think I sent that to you, David. So, and you were part of that. Maybe you testified even. But anyhow, so the point is that I think Soweto was very, very visible globally, but 73 also had important global impacts within the business community and stock exchanges and places like that. Because, as David says, they were terrified that a workers' movement would shake the foundations, the economic foundations of apartheid.
Sorry, if I could just add one thing. By the way, within months, we were banned. I was banned, house arrested. Yeah. I worked with MK when I was banned and with the unions. But we were slashed. Every day there was new bannings, new detentions, and so forth. Internationally, they recognized black workers, put on the map. Everyone said there should be trade union rights, but there were none.
Right.
We had to fight every single case. There wasn't one decent liberal employer with a multinational or anything of that kind who was prepared to openly recognize the trade unions. So my idea of a mass strike movement rolling on until we got, we'd broken the resistance, was broken up all the time. With arrests, but not of the mass, but of individuals, picking off leaders. And leaders are very important. It takes quite a lot of time to learn how to do trade unionism. Just not to be too extreme and not to be too reformist, to get it right so that you're winning actual reforms. You have to win reforms. You can't not do that. You're not a political organization as such. And can I say that in London, the anti-apartheid movement and the ANC in London and international gave no support to the African workers' movement or to the trade unions. I had bitter arguments, there, because I really accused them, and I got, reprimanded by the Communist Party, ANC, and eventually expelled for this, for saying that you are not standing. When workers go on strike in South Africa, you twiddle your thumbs, you don't even report it. Imagine that. You've got a revolution in South Africa, you don't support it.
Well, it's because it wasn't being led by SOC2, and therefore
it's that partly, but also they support the students because the students were prepared to commit suicide to die for the nation, all right? So that's what they wanted. They didn't want a living movement which has contradictions. You've got to unite the people. So anyway, that's my view. In other words, that parliamentary commission, the ANC boycotted all of that. They didn't give evidence. They didn't call for a living wage. They didn't call for trade union rights at all. In fact, they said that any trade unions that developed in South Africa would be compromised and useless. And but yet David, we were fighting every day and we were being banned.
I thought it was liberal white employers who ushered in trade unions in South Africa. Isn't that what Burl Lipton said? I'm joking, right?
But unfortunately, there's the art of ambiguity. You can stand and say, yes, I'm in favor of trade union rights, and you call the police when you have a strike.
Well, that's exactly what was
That's standard practice.
Or there was, yes, we're going to create a liaison committee, which management can dominate. I mean, that was really what they did. Oh, yes, we're for reform. Let's have some more committees so we can, communicate with our workers. So, yeah, there must be more questions rather than people just hearing David and me natter on about this.
I'm sorry, Alex. I think I have to abuse my chair now because of time. I can't take more questions, but I've dropped your email address on the chat box. Colleagues, if you want to engage with Alex further, you can get in touch with him. And I want to thank you again for the fascinating paper. It was an honor to have you today on this platform. And also a big thanks go to Dr. Hemson. Thank you so much, Doctor, for accepting to be our discussant today. And thank you for the substantial contribution to the conversation. We appreciate that. Colleagues, I think we'll meet again next month.
Excuse me, just before we conclude, can I make just one very short statement?
Okay,
I'm embarrassed. at times that our South African historians are not doing more, in terms of, social history of this kind, engaging with the actual strategic issues, which face, the working class. And I would encourage young researchers to get fully involved in this. And we need the African voice, if I can put it very bluntly, absolutely. And we'd love to hear from you. Thank you. Sorry for that.
Let me add to that.
It's-
There is a huge topic that can be done, which is the border industries. That's absolutely key in this period. This is the way that the employers in the state and the homelands leaders try to fend off this rising worker insurgency. One of the ways is to create the border industries, which fail. But there's tons of stuff in the archives on this, tons, and it's fascinating. I really encourage young African PhD students to check this out. No one has written about this.
Okay, thank you so much, David.
Thank you
Thank you so
all.
much, Alex. Thank you so much, colleagues, for being part of this conversation today. We appreciate that. We are going to meet again.